The K9 German shepherd that wouldn't stop howling. Then the truth was revealed. A canine German shepherd stands in the middle of the courtroom, howling relentlessly in front of the judge. People exchange nervous glances. What is the dog trying to say? Moments later, the shocking truth is unveiled, shaking the entire courtroom. No one saw this coming. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. The courtroom was silent, the tension thick as the judge adjusted his glasses. His cold, severe expression revealed nothing as he prepared to deliver his verdict. A decision that could shake the entire city. But before he could speak, a sharp, haunting sound cut through the stillness. A deep, guttural howl. Every person in the room turned toward the source of the sound. At the center of the courtroom, a K9 German shepherd stood rigid, its ears pinned back, eyes locked on the defendant. The dog's howls grew louder, more desperate, as if warning everyone of something unseen. The BFFs exchanged uneasy glances. The judge furrowed his brow, clearly irritated. "Control that dog," he ordered, his voice cutting through the air. The handler, Officer Mark Ellison, tightened his grip on the leash. But the shepherd, named Rex, refused to stop. His body trembled with tension, his stance unwavering. Something was wrong. The crowd murmured in confusion, some shifting nervously in their seats. And then, before anyone could react, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. All eyes turned. Standing in the middle of the aisle was a thin, dirty German shepherd. Her fur was matted, her ribs slightly visible beneath her coat, but her amber eyes burned with an unmistakable intensity. Her gaze was locked onto the defendant, a man in a dark suit sitting at the defense table. His face went pale. The murmurs in the courtroom grew into a restless murmur. Who was this dog? Where'd she come from? Rex stopped howling. Instead, he stood frozen, his ears perked, watching the female. It was as if he recognized her. The defendant's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the table. His confident facade had cracked. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. The judge slammed his gavel. What is the meaning of this? Officer Ellison hesitated before stepping forward. Your Honor, I don't know how she got in here, but she... He glanced at the dog, his voice faltering. She seems to be here for him. The room fell into an eerie silence as the German shepherd took slow, deliberate steps toward the defendant. Her movements were controlled, almost methodical, as if she had been waiting for this moment. And then the shock hit. A woman in the gallery gasped, clutching her chest. That's her. That's Shadow. The name sent ripples through the room. Shadow, the K9 who had gone missing months ago, the dog who had been presumed dead. But now she was here, standing in front of the very man accused of crimes no one could fully prove. The defendant shifted uncomfortably. This is absurd, he muttered, his voice shaking. Shadow took another step closer. Her low growl vibrated through the air. Rex, beside Officer Ellison, remained completely still, watching everything unfold. And then, in the midst of the stunned silence, Shadow did something that sent a chill down everyone's spine. She lifted her muzzle and let out a long, mournful howl. It was the sound of something lost, something broken, something that had finally come home to reveal a truth no one had been ready to face. The howl lingered in the air, sending a shiver through the courtroom. It wasn't just a sound, it was a statement, a call for justice that words could never express. Judge Caldwell rapped his gavel again, his patience clearly wearing thin. What is going on here? His gaze shifted between Shadow and the defendant, Leonard Grayson, whose face had gone from pale to ghostly white. She's just a stray. Grayson blurted out, his voice cracking. Get rid of her. But no one moved. No one believed him. Shadow stood her ground, unwavering. Her growl was low, but filled with something deeper than aggression. It was recognition. She knew Grayson, and from the fear in his eyes, he knew her too. Officer Mark Ellison tightened his grip on Rex's leash. He could feel the tension in his K9 partner, the way Rex was locked onto Shadow, processing something. Then, suddenly, Rex let out a quiet whimper, his ears twitching forward. Mark's stomach twisted. "She's not a stray," Mark said, his voice firm. He took a step toward the frail German shepherd, his heart pounding. "She's a police canine." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Judge Caldwell narrowed his eyes. "Do you have proof of that?" Officer Mark hesitated. No, he didn't, not yet. But something in his gut told him he was right. And Rex knew it too. "She looks familiar," Mark continued, his plan racing. "And she's reacting to Grayson like she knows him." "This is ridiculous." Grayson snapped, trying to regain his composure. "It's a dog. It doesn't mean anything." But Mark wasn't convinced. He crouched down, extending a slow, steady hand toward Shadow. The shepherd flinched but didn't back away. Instead, she sniffed the air, her tired eyes locking onto his. There was something haunted in her gaze. Mark carefully ran a hand over her fur, feeling the sharp bones beneath her thin coat. And then his fingers brushed against something on her neck, a small indentation. His breath hitched. A missing K9 would have had an embedded microchip. His heart pounded as he turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I request permission to scan this dog for identification. If I'm right, we're looking at a missing officer." Grayson shot up from his chair. "No, this is absurd. You can't just..." But it was too late. One of the BFFs had already left to retrieve a microchip scanner. Shadow didn't take her eyes off Grayson. She was waiting for the moment when the truth would finally be known. And from the way Grayson's hands were now clenched into fists, from the way sweat beaded on his forehead, Mark knew one thing for sure. He was terrified of what that scanner would reveal. The courtroom had never been this silent. Every eye was fixed on Shadow, the frail German shepherd who had appeared like a ghost from the past. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. As the bailiff returned with the microchip scanner in hand, Grayson shifted uncomfortably. His fingers twitched against the table. His confidence had all but vanished, replaced by something raw and unspoken. Fear. Mark took the scanner and slowly approached Shadow. She remained still, only her chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths. As Mark waved the scanner over her neck, a soft beep echoed through the room. A match. The courtroom collectively inhaled. Judge Caldwell leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Officer Ellison, does this dog have an identification?" Mark swallowed hard and checked the scanner screen. A serial number. A name. A registration tied to a police department from 5 years ago. "She's a registered K9, he announced, his voice firm. "Her name is Shadow. She was declared missing in action 3 years ago." Murmurs erupted in the gallery. "Missing?" someone whispered. "Then how is she here?" another voice questioned. Mark's blood ran cold as he read the last piece of information on the scanner. He turned his eyes toward Grayson. "She wasn't just missing," he said, his voice tight. "She was reported stolen." Gasps filled the courtroom. The judge slammed his gavel. "Order." Shadow let out a low growl, her eyes never leaving Grayson. It wasn't just recognition. It was accusation. Grayson shot up from his seat. "This is absurd. A dog can't." "This doesn't prove anything." His voice was shaky, wild. Mark clenched his jaw. "Then tell me, Grayson, why is she reacting to you?" The room was so silent that the faint hum of the air conditioning could be heard. Grayson was breathing hard, his nostrils flaring. But he didn't answer. He couldn't. The judge exhaled, clearly unsettled. He turned to the prosecutor. "I want an immediate investigation into this dog's disappearance and any possible connections to the defendant." Grayson's entire body tensed. His eyes darted toward the exit. Mark saw it before it happened. "Don't." But Grayson bolted. The courtroom erupted into chaos. The BFFs lunged, knocking over chairs as Grayson shoved past them. Papers flew through the air. People screamed. But Shadow was faster. With a burst of energy that no one expected from a dog in her condition, she leapt forward, cutting off Grayson's path. Her sharp bark ricocheted off the walls. Grayson skidded to a stop, panic in his eyes. In that moment, Shadow did something remarkable. She didn't attack. She didn't lunge. Instead, she sat down right in front of him, blocking his way, forcing him to face what he had done. Trembling, Grayson took a step back, but it was over. The BFFs grabbed him, slamming him against the table to cuff him. The trial wasn't even over yet, but the truth had already been exposed, and Shadow had made sure of it. The courtroom was still buzzing with shock as the bailiffs restrained Leonard Grayson. His face, once smug and composed, was now contorted with panic. Sweat dripped from his forehead. His breathing was ragged as he struggled against the cuffs. But there was no escaping it now. Shadow had returned for justice, and everyone in the room had seen the truth unfold before their eyes. Mark's pulse pounded in his ears as he crouched beside the frail German shepherd. Shadow's body trembled with exhaustion, but her eyes remained locked on Grayson, as if ensuring he wouldn't slip away this time. Mark ran a gentle hand over her matted fur, feeling the sharp ridges of her ribs. "She knew," he murmured. "She knew all along." Judge Caldwell, still gripping his gavel, exhaled deeply. He glanced at the prosecutor, who had already pulled out a legal pad, scribbling notes furiously. "Officer Ellison," the judge said, his voice steady but laced with curiosity. "You said this dog was reported stolen 3 years ago." Mark nodded. "That's right. Shadow was part of a high-level K-9 unit. She disappeared while working on an active case." He turned his gaze back to Grayson. "And if she's reacting to him like this, then I bet my badge she had something to do with it." The judge's eyes darkened with intrigue. "Prosecutor, I want those records pulled immediately." The prosecutor nodded, already making calls. Grayson scoffed, his voice dripping with forced arrogance. "This is ridiculous. You're basing an entire case on a dog's reaction? This is nothing more than a mutt that wandered in off the street." Shadow's ears flicked, her amber eyes narrowing. Mark clenched his fists, struggling to keep his temper in check. "She's not just a dog. She's an officer, and I don't believe in coincidences." The tension in the room thickened. The gallery murmured, whispering theories, debating what had just transpired. One of the bailiffs walked up to the judge's stand and handed over a file. "Your Honor," he said, adjusting his belt, "we just confirmed it. Shadow was last assigned to an undercover narcotics operation. Her last handler, Officer James Rohr, was killed during the mission." A ripple of gasps filled the courtroom. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He had heard the name before. James Rohr had been a respected officer, known for taking down major crime rings. His death had been ruled an accident, an unfortunate loss in the line of duty. But now Shadow was telling them something else. Judge Caldwell flipped through the report, his brows furrowing. "And there's more," he muttered. At the time of Officer Rohr's death, Shadow was declared missing. No one could determine what happened to her. His eyes snapped up, locking onto Grayson. "Until today." Grayson let out a nervous chuckle, shaking his head. "You can't be serious. This is all speculation." Mark stood, his fists clenching at his sides. "Then let's test it," he said. The entire room turned to him. Mark took a deep breath and nodded toward the BFFs. "Let's bring in a forensic K-9 unit. If Shadow was involved in that case, there's a chance she still remembers something. Let's see if she reacted to anything tied to Rohr's death." Grayson froze. His reaction was all Mark needed to see. "Wait," Grayson stammered. "You can't." But the judge raised a hand. "I think that an excellent idea, Officer Ellison." He looked toward the BFFs. "Get forensic K-9 handler down here immediately. I want to know exactly what this dog remembers." Grayson's panic deepened. He shook his head violently, his body twisting as if he wanted to run again. "This is insane. You can't just let a dog decide a man's fate." The judge gave him a pointed look. "No, Mr. Grayson, but the evidence she leads us to, that will decide your fate." For the first time, Grayson fell completely silent. Minutes passed, the weight of the situation settling in the air like a dense fog. Then the doors to the courtroom opened once more. A forensic K-9 handler entered, leading a young black Labrador by his side. The dog's nose twitched as it took in a new environment. Its handler was already preparing it for a search. Mark turned back to Shadow. Her breathing was slow, but her eyes were still alert. "Shadow," he said softly, crouching beside her, "I need you to help us one last time." Shadow blinked, and then, as if understanding his words, She slowly pushed herself to her feet. The forensic handler took out a cloth, one that had been stored in an evidence bag taken from Officer Rohr's old case files. He held it up and let the Labrador sniff it. At first, the dog immediately stiffened, its tail flicking in sharp concentration. Then it turned to Shadow. Mark watched as Shadow hesitated, her nose twitching. For a moment, it seemed like she was lost in thought, trapped in memories she hadn't wanted to relive. Then she stepped forward. One sniff, two, and then she growled, a deep, resonating sound that made the hair on Mark's arm stand up. She turned sharply toward Grayson, her body rigid, her stance unmistakably aggressive. The entire courtroom felt the shift in energy. "She knows," Mark murmured. Grayson's face contorted. He shook his head furiously. "No, this is a setup." Shadow barked, loud and firm, cutting off his words. Mark straightened. "She remembers you, Grayson. She remembers everything." The judge tapped his gavel, his expression hard as stone. "Mr. Grayson, based on this development, I'm ordering an immediate reopening of Officer Rohr's case." Grayson's breathing turned erratic. "You can't." "I can," the judge interrupted. "And I just did." Shadow let out one final growl, then turned her head toward Mark. And for the first time, he saw something different in her eyes. Relief. She had carried this burden alone for years. But now justice was finally catching up. The weight of the judge's ruling settled over the courtroom like a thundercloud. The murmurs of the crowd faded into an eerie silence as Leonard Grayson slumped in his chair, his face drained of all color. His once polished demeanor had crumbled into something raw and exposed, fear. Mark felt his pulse pounding. He glanced down at Shadow. The frail German shepherd stood firm, her ears twitching as if listening to the echoes of a past she had never been able to escape. But now that past was coming for Grayson, and there was nowhere left for him to run. The BFFs tightened their grip on the defendant's arms. But Grayson twisted, his voice shrill with desperation. "This is all circumstantial. You can't convict me based on some stray dog's reaction." Judge Caldwell's gaze was like steel. "Mr. Grayson, no one is convicting you yet. But this dog is not just any animal. She's a former K-9 officer. And if she was stolen the same night Officer Rohr was killed, that raises serious questions this court will not ignore." Grayson's jaw clenched, his knuckles whitening against the wooden table. His mind was racing. Mark could see in his eyes. Shadow, however, was no longer focused on Grayson. Instead, her nose lifted slightly, sniffing the air. Her posture shifted. Something had changed. Mark followed her line of sight and frowned. Shadow's attention wasn't on Grayson anymore. It was on the evidence box on the prosecution's table. A sense of unease trickled through Mark's veins. Shadow stepped forward, her paws silent against the polished floor. She approached the box with slow, deliberate movements. Then she stopped and growled, low and deep, not at Grayson, at the evidence itself. Mark's stomach tightened. He turned to the prosecutor, his voice firm. "What's in that box?" The prosecutor looked startled by the question, but quickly rifled through his notes. Some remaining documents from Officer Rohr's case. A few unprocessed pieces of evidence." "Open it," Mark interrupted. The prosecutor hesitated, then nodded. With careful hands, he removed the lid. Inside was a folder, a few sealed plastic bags, and a leather glove. It was old, worn from time, but the moment the lid came off, Shadow's growl deepened. Her lips curled slightly, teeth flashing. Mark's breath hitched. It wasn't just a growl of recognition. It was a growl of memory. Shadow remembered that glove. The prosecutor lifted it carefully, adjusting his latex gloves. This was found near the crime scene, but was never directly tied to anyone. We assumed it belonged to... Shadow lunged, not violently, not to attack, but with desperate urgency. She snapped her jaws just inches away from the glove. Her body trembled, her breaths ragged. It was hers. No, it belonged to the man who took her. Mark's entire body went cold. Judge Caldwell leaned forward. "Are you saying this belongs to the person who stole her?" Shadow went pacing, the energy radiating from her in waves. She was remembering something she had carried with her all these years. And then the most unexpected sound cut through the courtroom. Grayson laughed, a bitter, humorless sound that sent a chill up Mark's spine. When Mark turned, Grayson was shaking his head, his eyes filled with something dark and unsettling. "You think that stupid dog actually remembers?" he sneered, his voice laced with mockery. "You think she knows who took her? Who killed that cop?" Mark's fist clenched. "You're scared," he said quietly. "That's why you're talking like this." Grayson's smirk twitched. He scoffed, leaning back against the chair. "You really think a dog's memory will hold up in court?" The judge remained silent. The prosecutor exchanged a glance with Mark. "With forensics, we don't have to rely on her memory." Grayson's smirk faded. Mark exhaled, his voice steady but razor sharp. "If that glove has DNA evidence on it and Shadow recognizes it, then we have something tangible." The forensic handler, still standing near the evidence table, nodded. "We can process this right now," he said. "A rapid test could at least confirm if there's any human DNA left on the leather." The color drained completely from Grayson's face. Mark knew that look. The look of a man who had just realized the walls were closing in. Judge Caldwell tapped his gavel once, nodding to the forensic team. "Proceed with testing this. This trial is adjourned until further analysis is completed." A murmur spread to the crowd as the BFFs prepared to escort Grayson out. But before they could move, Shadow took a step forward. And for the first time, Grayson met her eyes. For the first time, he saw what Mark had seen all along. Not just a dog, not just a former K9, but a survivor. Grayson's lips parted, but no words came because there was nothing left to say. The truth was already on its way, and Shadow had made sure of that. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension as the forensic team carefully collected the leather glove for analysis. The moment the judge adjourned the session, murmurs erupted across the room, filling the space with speculation, disbelief, and curiosity. But amidst all the noise, Shadow remained still. The frail German shepherd sat next to Mark, her amber eyes locked onto Leonard Grayson as he was being escorted out in handcuffs. She didn't growl this time, didn't lunge. She simply watched, as if ensuring that he wouldn't slip away again. Mark placed a hand on her back, feeling the subtle tremors running through her thin frame. She had carried the weight of this moment for 3 long years, and now that justice was finally catching up, she seemed to be processing it in real time. "You did it," Mark murmured under his breath. Rex, his own K9 partner, let out a soft whine, pressing his nose gently against Shadow's ear. It was as if he understood what she had been through, as if he was offering silent reassurance that she wasn't alone anymore. The courtroom slowly began to empty. Reporters rushed outside to cover the breaking story. Attorneys and officers discussed the shocking revelation that had just unfolded. The case had taken an unexpected turn, one that no one could have predicted, but Mark. He knew deep down that Shadow had been leading them to the truth from the very beginning. Judge Caldwell had remained at his bench, flipping through the case file one last time before looking up. His gaze softened as he studied Shadow, and for the first time in the entire trial, his voice wasn't sharp. It was thoughtful. "Officer Ellison," Mark stood at attention. "Your Honor, I want this dog protected." The judge's words were firm, but there was something else in them. Respect. "She's been through hell and back. I expect she'll be given the care she deserves." Mark nodded. "I'll take her in." Shadow turned her head slightly at his words, her ears flicking. "You're sure?" the judge asked. Mark looked down at Shadow. She had survived against impossible odds, fought her way back to reveal the truth. A dog like her didn't just need a home. She needed someone who understood what she had been through. And Mark, he was ready. "I'm sure," he said. The judge gave a small nod before dismissing him. "Then take her home, officer." Mark exhaled, then knelt beside Shadow. "Come on, girl," he whispered. "Let's get you out of here." She hesitated at first, as if she didn't quite believe she was free to leave. But then, slowly, she rose to her feet. She moved gingerly, her body still weak from years of neglect. But when Rex nudged her side in silent encouragement, she took a deep breath and stepped forward. Mark guided her past the gallery, past the reporters shouting questions, past the echoes of the courtroom, that had once held the secrets of her past. But now, as she walked beside him, those secrets no longer held power over her. For the first time in 3 years, Shadow wasn't running. She was finally going home. The drive to Mark's house was quiet, save for the gentle hum of the engine and the occasional glance from Rex, who sat in the back seat, watching Shadow with careful curiosity. Mark kept sneaking glances at her in the rear-view mirror. She had curled up on the passenger seat, her head resting on the door. Her eyes fluttered open and closed. The exhaustion was finally catching up to her. "You did good today," Mark said softly. Shadow's tail gave a single, slow wag, barely visible, but it was there, a small sign that, despite everything, she understood. Mark tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He had seen plenty of cases throughout his career, had witnessed firsthand how evil some people could be. But this had been different. Shadow hadn't just been a victim. She had been a warrior, surviving long enough to make sure the truth was heard. And now she had a second chance. By the time they pulled into Mark's driveway, the sun had started to set, casting a golden glow over the house. He opened the door, stepping out before gently lifting Shadow into his arms. She let out a small grunt of protest, but she didn't fight him. "You'll get used to this," Mark said with a small smile. "Trust me." He carried her inside, setting her down carefully on a soft dog bed in the living room. Rex trotted over, circling around her before settling down beside her, his warm body pressing gently against hers. Shadow let out a deep, exhausted sigh. Mark knelt beside her, running a careful hand through her fur. "You're safe now," he murmured. "No more running. No more fear." Shadow didn't move at first, then after a long pause, she shifted closer to Rex and let her eyes close completely. For the first time in years, she let herself rest. And in that moment, Mark knew she was finally home. The night was calm, a peaceful contrast to the storm Shadow had endured for years. She lay beside Rex, her breathing steady, her body finally at rest. Mark watched them in silence. A small smile tugged at his lips. She was safe. She was home. And for the first time in years, Shadow closed her eyes, not out of fear, but in peace. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and share with someone who believes in the power of loyalty and justice. Shadow's journey reminds us that courage never fades, and the truth always finds a way.